Unfortunately, NAACP did not publicize her protest on bus segregation. This was because she was young, just 15 years old. They considered her to be too feisty, emotional, and mouthy to be a good symbol for the bus boycotts that she had established with her resistance. A little after her arrest, Colvin became pregnant. This only added to the many reasons the NAACP had for passing her over. Instead, Rosa Parks became the face of bus segregation when she refused to give up her seat. While the lack of credit was disappointing for Claudette, she wasn't angry about it. She knew that no matter who was chosen, everyone wanted the same outcome to be treated as equals. If you've ever had your clothes dry cleaned, then you have this black inventor to thank. Thomas L. Jennings was the first African American person to receive a patent in the United States. This was important because during this time in history, slaves were not the owners of their inventions. The slave owners were. U.S. patent laws said that the slave master is the owner of the fruits of the labor of the slave, both manual and intellectual. So legally, slaves had no ownership to their own ideas and inventions. I wonder how many inventions were stolen or kept secret during this time in history. Mr. Jennings was a dry cleaner and a tailor living in New York and had invented a method of dry cleaning called dry scourging, which he had patented in 1821. This was 4 years before a Paris tailor named John Baptiste Holly refined his own dry cleaning technique in what many whites claim as history's first dry cleaning business. As usual, many people objected to an African American receiving a patent, but nothing was stopping him. Mr. Jennings had a loophole. He was a freed man and qualified to receive a patent, and he did. Congress started extending patent rights to all African American individuals, both freedmen and slaves, paving the way for the future black inventors to gain exclusive rights to their inventions and ideas. Mr. Jennings used the money from his invention to free the rest of his family and donated to abolitionist causes. Third is Diane Nash, who was a freedom rider and nonviolent student activist for desegregation. Diane grew up in Chicago, and left to attend Fisk University in Nashville, Tennessee. It was here that she experienced the ugliness of desegregation within the Jim Crow South. The whites-only signs throughout Nashville inspired Diane to chair the SNCC, Student Nonviolent Coordination Committee, in 1960. Diane organized nonviolent sit-ins at segregated lunch counters throughout Nashville, which was highly effective in ending the discriminatory practices at restaurants. In 1961, Diane took over responsibility for the Freedom Rides, a protest against segregated bus terminals that took place on Greyhound buses from Washington, D.C. to Virginia. During one of the Freedom Rides, they were encountered by a mob of angry segregationists as they entered Anniston, Alabama. All of the Freedom Riders were brutally beaten and unable to finish the route. However, under direction of Nash, the Freedom Rides continued, protesting from Birmingham, Alabama to Jackson, Mississippi. On one specific ride, Nash received a call from John Sigan Thaler, who was the assistant to Attorney General Robert Kennedy Jr. He tried to persuade her to end the Freedom Rides, since in their eyes, all it created was bloodshed. Nash was unstaken by the stance of the White House. She told Sigan Thaler that they knew the risk involved, and had already prepared their wills before continuing the freedom rides. The work that Diane Nash and her team did opened the door for us to be able to ride a bus from state to state. Next on the list is Mark E. Dean. He has made homework internet research and, yes, writing sermons a whole lot less stressful and colorful. This computer scientist engineer worked for IBM, where he and his team designed hardware interface that allowed multiple devices like printers, modems, and keyboards to be plugged into a computer. This innovation helped pave the way for personal computers' use in home and business settings. Mr. Dean is the reason you can see his picture in color, since he helped develop the first color computer monitor, along with a team of programmers that created the world's first gigahertz chip in 1999. This amazing computer scientist holds 3 of the company's original 9 patents and more than 20 patents together. He was inducted into the National Inventors Hall of Fame in 1997 and currently teaches computer science and is professor at the University of Tennessee. I know his class is tough. Fifth on the list is Ella Baker. Without Ella Baker, there would be no civil rights movement. Ella Baker grew up listening to her grandmother's firsthand stories about slave revolts, which sparked her passion for social justice and equality. In 1931, she joined the Young Negroes Cooperative League and soon became the group's national director, supporting its mission to develop Black economic power through collective planning. She taught courses in consumer education, labor history, and African history for the Workers' Education Project and founded the Negro History Club at the Harlem Library in New York. Baker advocated grassroots organizing, radical democracy, and widespread action as a mean of change, which influenced the civil rights movement and led to its success. She once stated, "You didn't see me on television. You didn't see news stories about me. The kind of role that I tried to play was to pick up the pieces, or put together pieces out of which I hoped my organization might come." My theory is, strong people don't need strong leaders. Charles R. Drew is a lifesaver, literally, and not just for Black people, but for all races. Charles Richard Drew is the physician responsible for America's first major blood banks. Dr. Drew was a surgeon, and during his postgraduate internship and residency, he studied transfusion medicine. He refined key methods of collecting, processing, and storing plasma while studying at Columbia University. During World War II, Drew was put in charge of a project called Blood for Britain. He helped collect thousands of pints of plasma from New York hospitals and ship them overseas to treat European soldiers. Drew is also responsible for introducing the use of bloodmobiles, refrigerated trucks that served as collection centers and transported blood. The following year, Drew developed another blood bank for military personnel under the American Red Cross, which became the American Red Cross Blood Donor Service. Imagine doing all of that to find out that the military separated blood donations according to race. Now, I don't know about y'all, but if I had just been shot up or blown up, would I really care where the blood came from? The military behavior angered Dr. Drew so much that he resigned shortly after. He spent the remainder of his life working as a surgeon and a professor. And in 1943, he became the first African American doctor to be chosen as an examiner for the American Board of Surgery. Unfortunately, he died in 1950. Okay, how many of y'all have a security system at home? Well, homeowners, the reason you rest a little easier is because of Mary Van Britten Brown. Mrs. Brown was a nurse and inventor who invented a precursor to the modern home TV security system. There was a time when the crime rate was an all-time high in her New York City neighborhood, and cops didn't always respond to emergencies. More than likely, they didn't respond since it was a black neighborhood. To feel safer, Brown and her husband developed a way for a motorized camera to peer through a set of peepholes and project images onto a TV monitor. The device also included a two-way microphone to speak with a person outside, and an emergency alarm button to notify the police. The Browns filed a patent for their closed-circuit television system in 1966, and it was approved on December 2nd, 1969. Her work was allowed companies like ADT, Simply Safe, Vivint, Protect America, and yes, Ring, to build and improve the coverage they provide to our homes and businesses no matter where we are in the world. Next is George Caruthers, an astrophysicist, engineer, and inventor who spent much of his career working in the Space Science Division of the Naval Research Laboratory in Washington, D.C. He's most famous for creating the ultraviolet camera spectrograph, which NASA used it when it launched Apollo 16 in 1972. This camera helped to prove that molecular hydrogen existed in interstellar space and allowed NASA to take pictures of the moon, Earth, stars, and galaxies. In 1974, space scientists used a new model version of the camera to observe Halley's Comet and other celestial phenomenon on the U.S. first space station, Skylab. Caruthers was inducted into the National Inventors Hall of Fame in 2003. Every time you see a picture of outer space, thank God for Mr. Caruthers. Ninth on my list is Made Ballou. In 1955, Made Ballou, a program director of the first black radio station in Montgomery, Alabama, was approached by her husband's friend, Martin Luther King Jr., to be his personal secretary. Ballou agreed and became Dr. King's right-hand woman from 1955 until 1960. This was during our country's history of great unrest and transforming events, which included the Montgomery bus boycott, the publication of Dr. King's first book, Stride Towards Freedom, and the prayer pilgrimage for peace in Washington, D.C. Mrs. Ballou workplace her in enormous danger, so much that in 1957, she was listed as number 21 on the Montgomery Improvement Association's list of persons in churches most vulnerable to violent attacks, which basically means that she was number 21 on a hit list. Dr. King was number 1 and could be assassinated on any day at any time. Mrs. Ballou was fearless and trusted God, and they worked in the work that they were doing, even though her children's lives were threatened by the KKK. The KKK members watched her at work through the windows of the church. She never folded and never gave up. She just kept on working. Take a second to look at the windows. You ain't see nobody. She says, "I was a daredevil, I guess." She told the Washington Post in 2015, "I didn't have time to worry about what might happen, or what had happened, or what would happen." She said, "We were very busy doing things, knowing that anything could happen, and we just kept on going. Balu passed away last summer on August 26, 2019. She was 93 years old. Lastly, but surely not least, is Fred Shuttlesworth. Fred Shuttlesworth was born on March 18, 1922, in Mount Meigs, Alabama. He was an American minister and civil rights activist who worked tirelessly to end segregation in the South. Mr. Shuttlesworth began preaching at the First Baptist Church in Selma, Alabama, but left that position in 1952 to take over as pastor of Birmingham's Bethel Baptist Church. It was there in Birmingham that Mr. Shuttlesworth became increasingly involved with the civil rights movement. He worked with such organizations as the Civic League and National Association for the Advancement of Colored People, NAACP, on efforts that included increased voter registration among African Americans. In 1956, he founded the Alabama Christian Movement for Human Rights, which sought to overturn Birmingham's segregation laws. The following year, he, Martin Luther King Jr., and others established the Southern Christian Leadership Conference. Now, personally, I think that Mr. Shuttlesworth was one of Christian's gangsters in the civil rights movement. His mind was so made up that the KKK and others tried continually to take his life. Let me explain. On Christmas Day in 1956, his home was blown up by the KKK. The house fell on top of him, but he survived. A few days later, he's back on the pulpit preaching. In 1957, he was protesting in a white-only waiting room and was attacked and beaten by a mob of 100 white prosecutors. He boarded a train to continue his work that same day. Later that year, he attempted to enroll his daughters in an all-white high school. He was beaten with bats and bicycle chains by another mob. In 1958, his church was bombed. 6 years later, one of those bombers would be responsible for killing the 4 little girls in the 16th Street church bombing. He was sued, had his car confiscated, and beaten almost to death with a fire hose. How many of us would continue to work for desegregation and equality after all that? Especially for people who could be so ungrateful at times. Mr. Shuttlesworth didn't give up. He considered the man most feared by Southern racists. He helped organize the historic March for Voting Rights from Selma to Montgomery, Alabama in 1965. Housing was a problem for Black families, and so he became a landlord, purchasing 80 rental units and establishing the Shuttlesworth Housing Foundation in Cincinnati in the 1980s. This foundation provided a source of low-income housing for anyone who needed it. He received the Presidential Citizen Medal, the country's second highest civilian award, from U.S. President Bill Clinton in 2001. 5 years later, he retired from the ministry. He died October 5, 2011. Birmingham, Alabama, after suffering complications from a stroke. He was a true gangster in the civil rights movement. What do all these people have in common? They were all part of a movement to better the lives of us. Amen. Through equality, freedom, invention, and knowledge. Their end goal was to continue to move forward and to create better histories in our Black culture. Amen. How do you do that? Well, education is key. Whether academic or vocational, we should never stop learning and growing, developing ideas and inventing. It is in our blood as us people. Church, we too are part of the movement, but our fight is not with racial division. Ours is a spiritual fight, and we can choose to move forward, we can choose to move back, or stand still in our fight to get to heaven. Philippians chapter 4, verse 13 tells us, "Brothers, I do not consider that I have made it my own, but one thing I do, forgetting what lies behind and straining forward to what lies ahead. I press on toward the goal, for the prize of the upward call of God in heaven Christ." Amen. Good news, Christ has already fought for us. He was beaten, spat on, cursed at, and nailed to a cross. Unlike the sacrifices of those in the civil rights movement, Christ didn't die for a specific race or people. He died for the entire world. Amen. All we have to do is seek, and we will find him. Amen. Call, and he will answer. Knock, and he will open the door. Amen. Isaiah chapter 40, verse 31 says, "But they who wait for the Lord shall renew their strength. They shall mount up with wings like eagles. They shall run and not be weary. They shall walk and not faint." Let us not forget our Black history, whose stories empower and pave path for success for us. Let us not forget or neglect the one, Jesus Christ, whose story provided us with salvation and everlasting life.
Oh, happy Sabbath, church. Will a man rob God? Yeah, you have robbed me. But you say in what we have robbed you, and tithes and offering. May the deacon come forward to collect the offering.